I got a chance to talk to Bo Nix before the draft, and the one thing that he did in college, and I guarantee this was a big factor in the way Sean Payton saw him, evaluated him, and thought that he'd work for him, was that Bo Nix called the protections in the Oregon offense. Very, very few quarterbacks at the college level deal with protections.
You're tuned in to the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, guiding your gridiron journey, none other than your host, former NFL lineman, Ross Tucker.
Oh, yeah, it is. But it's not just any Ross Tucker Football Podcast. It never is, but especially not on a teaching tutorial Thursday. Yes, we know that's redundant. It's kind of an inside joke because that means we've got Greg Cosell here. He joins us once a week. He is the NFL Films legend. A lot of you tell me it's your favorite day of the week. I love hearing that on social media at Ross Tucker NFL, at Ross Tucker Pod. We also do good numbers on YouTube when we have the Civilian Goat, youtube.com/Ross Tucker NFL. Interestingly, not nearly as much news today as there was on yesterday's show with Andrew Brandt, but still some things to get to after we talk with Greg. But we need to finish up our critically acclaimed series, which has been awesome. We have done every division over the last 7 weeks. So this is the 8th and final one, which is cool because for those of you that might have missed summer vacation, 4th of July, whatever, just go back on your podcast app or on YouTube and listen or watch one of the divisions that you missed. Starting next week, we're going to talk more about some of the training camp news, some of the schematic trends, but we'll still have Greg every week, and we got about a month left of doing 3 days a week. Then we will shift into regular season mode, and this show will be daily, Monday through Friday. Tell everybody you know, if they want to know what's going on in the NFL in about 26 minutes or less, there is no better way to be informed than the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. Thought, by the way, yesterday's Fantasy Feast, man, John Daigle, Rich Rebar, those guys are smart. If you want to hear about a lot of the skill guys and stuff going on with them, gosh, those guys, they have a stat for everything. It's crazy. It's also Big Show time.
The Big Show.
Okay, Greg, before we get into the AFC West, because there's a lot of juicy topics in that division, actually. We might have saved the best for last. I did want to get your thoughts on a couple players that are in the news. The first one, Tyrann Mathieu, elected to retire on the eve of training camp. I think it was surprising. Certainly Mickey Loomis, the Saints GM, said he was a little bit surprised by that. The Saints went ahead and they signed Julian Blackmon. I'll ask you about him momentarily, but I think the Honey Badger, Mathieu, ended up playing 12 years. What will you remember from him, and kind of what lessons, if any, do you take from a career like the one he had?
Ross, I don't know how you couldn't love watching Tyrann Mathieu play. I mean, the guy was just a really good football player. Besides just being a great player, he was so enthusiastic about playing. But he was a guy that you could line up in multiple spots in the secondary. He could play either safety position. He played in the slot a lot in his career. It's a word I don't use very often, but it fits him extremely well, is instinctive. He just saw the game one step ahead of everybody. He was just a really, really good football player. I'll be really curious to see 5 years from now how he's viewed as a Hall of Fame candidate, because, I mean, he was a really good football player.
I got several things to say about him. The one that two jump out to me, Greg, and I want to throw them at you and get your feedback. Number one is he was not a height, weight, speed guy.
No.
I mean, he's not tall, and he doesn't run overly well. So maybe he's an outlier in that regard, but I feel like at the positions he played, safety and nickel, there are guys, Greg, it's like a point guard in basketball, right? There are guys that just see things better than others. And I'll go back to college. the amount of times the ball found him or he found the ball, it's like how the best soccer players, every time there's a shot on goal and the goalie saves it, but he hits it, the ball goes right to where they are, or like where Wayne Gretzky, it just seemed like the ball found him or he found the ball. And that's not an accident, Greg. That's observation number one.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I think that that's true. We talk about that with quarterbacks, but it's true about back-end defensive players as well, the way they just see things, because they have to see the whole field. And I'm not sure you can teach that, Ross. It's like a point guard in basketball. You can't teach someone to see the court like Magic Johnson saw the court. You can't do that. You either see it that way or you don't. And, you can look at the iPad, you can do it on the blackboard, you can walk through it in practice. You know this, you played. But some guys just see it and some guys don't, and you can't really teach that.
The second thing is, it's funny because I don't think you would ever say that someone that's undersized and not particularly fast is the prototype. But when I look at him, Greg, it makes me wonder if a guy that can play both nickel and safety is really what you want these days, especially at safety. Especially at safety, you would love to have a guy that you could put at nickel because of the run responsibilities, because of the coverage responsibilities, and still feel good about it. I think it was last week you talked about Arizona. That's kind of almost inverted those guys at times where you can't tell which one's which. And as we get into some schematic trends, it just seems like more and more teams, you look at Chauncey Gardner-Johnson or the Eagles drafting Makuba, they want that guy that can kind of play both roles.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the Eagles, and obviously we're not going to be talking about the NFC East today, and it's extremely early in training camp, but the first day of practice, Cooper DeJean was at safety. So, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out if he's a safety in base and then goes to nickel in their sub. And you're right about that. Denver is a team that we'll be talking about today. Look at what they did with Jahdae Barron, who has kind of those traits. They probably see him as their slot corner in their sub defenses, but you wonder if he'll get snaps at safety as well. Who knows? Those players are really, really valuable. There's not many guys who can do that well.
Let's get into it with the Broncos. You teed me up perfectly, Greg. We usually go alphabetical order. It starts with Denver. I think they surprised a bunch of people last year. And it's interesting, Greg, because we've talked about this. I don't remember any other teams being linked to Bo Nix. It felt like in February, everybody knew the Broncos were going to draft Bo Nix. And because of that, I think it's fair to say that he and they really exceeded expectations. I don't know many people that thought that Bo Nix and the Broncos would make the playoffs last year.
No, but you know how I felt about that because even before the Combine, when I had finished doing my Bo Nix evaluation, I had said that I thought he'd be a perfect Sean Payton quarterback just because of the timing, the rhythm, the fact that Nix in college did not show a big arm, but actually it was better in the NFL. Because I remember the one thing that really started to stand out to me about Bo Nix as I watched each week was the way he made those deep dig throws with a lot more juice than I would have expected based on his college tape. And, I got a chance to talk to Bo Nix before the draft. And the one thing that he did in college, and I guarantee this was a big factor in the way Sean Payton saw him, evaluated him, and thought that he'd work for him, was that Bo Nix called the protections in the Oregon offense. And you know as well as I, you do college games, that very, very few quarterbacks at the college level deal with protections. That's not the way the college game is taught. So that gave Bo Nix a leg up, particularly when it comes to playing in a Sean Payton offense. But Nix played extremely well. He showed a little more mobility than people thought, and quite frankly, he threw the ball better than a lot of people thought.
It's interesting, Greg. I've been on teams where the quarterback handled all the protections and totally ran the show. And, it was Tom Brady, right? And that he had an encyclopedic knowledge of what was going on. I was with other teams where they tried to have the quarterback call the protections, and he was pretty good at it, usually, but then we'd have to overrule him if he was wrong. And even when he would call the protections, Greg, he didn't call it with nearly the same conviction that Brady did, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Brady, there was zero hesitation in Brady changing anything, right? Like anything. Where there's other ones that you could, maybe it's just the strength of the voice or the conviction with which they said it. But other times, let's make 54 the mic. Whereas Brady would be like, 54 is the mic, Rita.
Right.
You know what I mean? There's a difference, and you can hear it in their voice.
Well, and the thing is, you know as well as I that quarterbacks brought up today, beginning from the time they play quarterback, 10, 11 years old, for the most part, nothing's 100%, but pretty much for the most part, they're not taught about those things. So how many quarterbacks in this league now are really true pre-snap guys that control the game? I'm not talking about a guy that can, do what you just said and say, oh, 54, he's the mic. Theoretically, a lot of guys can do that. But how many guys really, when you think about it, control the game from the line of scrimmage pre-snap? There's very, very few of those guys because that's not the way these guys are brought up playing the quarterback position.
On the defensive side, Greg, that's where they brought some new guys in, a couple of Niners, Hufanga and Greenlaw, even though the Niners were trying to keep Greenlaw. You mentioned the first-round pick, Jahdae Barron. I'll just say defensively, for whatever reason, Zach Allen does not get enough love.
Oh, well, let me tell you
He is
something.
tremendous, but people don't talk about him enough.
No, and they should. And Franklin Myers is another guy because the foundation, they led the NFL in sacks last year, by the way. A lot of people might not be aware of that. And the foundational premise of Vance Joseph's defense with their pressure schemes is they gap you out, Ross, so you get a lot of one-on-one matchups, okay? That's how they go about it. So you get Cooper and Benito on the edge. You get Zach Allen and Franklin Myers inside. This is what they do exceptionally well. You know how it is. If you line up with 5 across on your defensive front or 6 across, you're gapping out the offensive line. They gotta go with what we call 5-0 protection. You know all this. They have to match up 1-on-1. So they gap you out. You get these one-on-one matchups. I'm really curious to see Barron because I'm curious to see if they're going to play more 5-1 nickel because Barron, as the slot corner, he gives you a lot more toughness and competitiveness as a run defender than McMillan, who's a nice player. But, Barron is a different player. So I'm really anxious to see their defense, but their defense is a fun watch.
Let's talk Chiefs, Greg, and I'll do my season preview in a few weeks. I got to just tell you, I'm very high on the Chiefs. Very high on the Chiefs. If these receivers, Rashee Rice and Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy, are all healthy at the same time, goodness gracious. And I do think they'll be better at left tackle, maybe at both tackles this year on the offensive line, which would really help.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see because obviously they did have Worthy last year. Brown, I guess, came back mid-season or so. I forget the exact game. But, what was fascinating about Mahomes last year is when he threw the ball 20 or more yards in the air from the line of scrimmage, he was among the worst in the league in terms of completion percentage, which is very odd because obviously he can make those throws. That's not the issue. But he only completed 26% of his passes when the ball went in the air 20 or more yards from the line of scrimmage. And quite frankly, Worthy was not a vertical dimension in their offense a year ago for a guy with that kind of speed. So it'll be interesting to see, what adjustments they make in their offense. You have to adjust from year to year. For good teams, it's a lot of tweaks more than big-time adjustments. But you mentioned the tackle position. They signed Jalen Moore from the 49ers, who they did not view as a starter, obviously. He wasn't going to beat out Trent Williams anyway, but they didn't view him as a starter. They drafted Josh Simmons, who I thought, along with Connerly, who the Commanders drafted, was one of the 2 most athletic tackle prospects in the draft. So we'll see. We'll see what I guess they're going to move Sua Matea, the second-year player, inside to play left guard. We'll see how that goes. So they do have a few questions. I mean, obviously with Humphrey and Trey Smith, they've got 2 of the best in the league at their positions. But I think the other 3 positions, look, Jawan Taylor's not been very good. You just have to be honest. He's not been very good at right tackle. You know that.
That is a fact. Interestingly, I think Mahomes was quoted this week, Greg, as saying he needs to be better throwing the ball down the field. So he is aware of it. Maybe he knows the stat, but he's certainly cognizant of it because he literally referenced it this week. So good timing on that stat
and the other
by
factor,
you.
if I could just add quickly, Ross, is
I don't have big worries about them defensively.
No, and I'm not worried about
Spagnuolo
Mahomes.
and that talent, they should be ready to roll.
Yeah, we're not talking about a bad player, obviously. But the other interesting thing about Mahomes, before we move on, he does have a big arm, obviously, but he doesn't throw the ball outside the numbers a lot. They work the middle of the field. That's really the foundation of their pass game. So it'll be interesting to see if that's something they look at during this training camp and work on and work outside the numbers more.
And then defensively, Greg, your thoughts on anything new Spags might do? Obviously, the Super Bowl was not a good day for them, but they still have a lot of key pieces over there. They got Karlaftis locked up. I don't think they got McDuffie locked up yet.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a ton of changes on their defense. Obviously, they've got Christian Fulton now to play corner. McDuffie, it'll be interesting to see. Last year they ended up moving McDuffie outside because they had to, but they signed Fulton, who's been around the league, but he was a second-round pick originally by the Titans. So we'll see, as the season starts and progresses, where McDuffie plays. He's a really good player. One player who's really been good on their defense, and depending on what happens with McDuffie, it'll dictate how many snaps this guy gets, but that's Shamari Connor, number 27. He's been a really good kind of unknown player for this defense, but he's done a really good job when he's played. But otherwise, there's a lot of the same pieces on this front group. They lost Nada, but he was basically a run stuffer. So it's pretty much the same front group.
All right, let's move on to a very interesting team, the Las Vegas Raiders. They keep bringing in veteran guys.
Yeah.
Mafi at guard, Philip Dorsett at receiver, Raheem Mostert at running back. It's very clear. Jamal Adams at safety. It's not exactly a youth movement, Greg. They've made the decision. They got an old head coach. They got an older quarterback. They're trying. I think Pete Carroll's quote was, "We're going to win this year."
Well, obviously, with what they've done, that's the feeling because they have a professional quarterback now in Geno Smith. Obviously, they're going to count on Genti to be a true foundation back, whatever that means in terms of number of carries, but the offense will work through him. Obviously the receiver position is still a little bit up in the air, but, they're counting on the O-line to be better. They still have a lot of young players that they're counting on to improve, particularly at the guard, center, and right tackle position. Defensively is where they really brought in a ton of veterans. And they're good players. They brought in Wilkins, they brought in Jermaine Pratt, Elandon Roberts, Jeremy Chin, Eric Stokes. These are solid NFL players, so you would expect their defense to be meaningfully better than it was a year ago. You look at their roster, you would think this is a competitive football team right now. The key is the quarterback position. Geno Smith is a professional quarterback. You can line up and play with Geno Smith every week.
I think that's the biggest thing, obviously. A professional quarterback, professional head coach, Greg, right?
Yep.
Like a guy that has been there, done it. I think rather than swinging for the fences, they're just trying to get back to respectability on some level.
Yeah, and don't discount Chip Kelly. Chip Kelly is, he's really good with the run game. People probably always think spread offense, you throw it around. He is really good with the run game. And obviously they have Genti, they've got Mostert. They've got speed in the backfield. And, that means something. So, again, it's not college football, but wherever Chip's been in college, the run game has been a huge deal. And he really starts his offense with the run game. He wants to run the ball.
Greg, a year ago, I was at the Mountain West Media Days in Las Vegas at Circa, and Ashton Genti was not allowed to come because it's a 21 and older only property. So we met with the two best players for every Mountain West team. And obviously Genti's the best player in the whole league, but he was under 21. So he wasn't allowed to come. He was in a different hotel than everybody else. He was across the street just because they had him take some pictures and stuff, but he wasn't allowed in the building.
I'm
like, this guy's going to be a top 10 pick. We can't let him in for a day so I can talk to him?
Yeah.
It's crazy. But I guess rules are rules. All right, let's get to another fascinating team, and that is Jim Harbaugh's Los Angeles Chargers. And they got something weird going on, Greg, with Najee Harris and his eye. It's a fireworks incident. He's not practicing. I guess he was getting treatment in Stanford. We don't know what the situation is there, but clearly, they want to use multiple backs, and that's kind of what Greg Roman likes to do.
Yeah, I mean, he's not as good a back as Omarion Hampton, their rookie that they drafted in the first round. And who knows how they're going to map out the carries, but he's not as good as Hampton. I thought Hampton's tape was really, really good over the last 2 years. Obviously, they thought so too. But, this is with Greg Roman, the run game element is going to be the starting point. I mean, look what they did with Scott Matlock, a name a lot of people do not know, number 44. He became what is essentially the Patrick Ricard when Greg Roman was in Baltimore, and the way they used Patrick Ricard essentially as a blocker. They essentially played with 4 eligible receivers, and Ricard was a blocker because they had such a strong belief in the run game. They used Scott Matlock, who's a defensive tackle, in the same way, and he played meaningful snaps on offense. I would imagine you'll see similar things. So we'll see. I was kind of intrigued what they did at the wide receiver position in the draft. Trey Harris, out of Ole Miss, they drafted with their 2nd round pick. Now, that means they expect him to play. The other guy who they drafted, who I found really fascinating on tape, was Keandre Lambert-Smith, a Penn State transfer to Auburn, who I thought his tape was good, and I thought he could run. So it'll be interesting to see how they mix the run game and the play-action pass game. I think that's something that they want to get better at and do more of, is the play-action pass game off all these run game dimensions, which they're really good at.
Well, and they need those rookies to step up, Greg, because on the eve of training camp, Mike Williams retired. That surprised me. I thought him going back to Herbert and the Chargers, I actually thought that was going to be a good fit, in that offense.
Yeah, no, he retired, and so they need those guys. But we saw what Ladd McConkey did a year ago, which didn't surprise me. I loved him coming out. To me, McConkey, for what he is, and you always have to evaluate a guy for what he is, Ross. You know that. You're not going to look at Ladd McConkey and go, oh man, he's not good because he's not going to make big contested catches over tall corners. For what Ladd McConkey is, he really doesn't have a weakness in his game.
Check him out on social media at Greg Cosell. Fantastic work as always. Looking forward to diving into some of these training camp news and notes, as well as some of the schematic trends to look for this year next week, Greg. Thanks so much for the time.
Thanks, Ross. Appreciate it.
All right, let's dive into the news. But first, you know what's delicious? Labatt Blue Light. You know what's even more delicious? Getting incredible Labatt Blue Light merch just for drinking Labatt Blue Light. It is a fantastic tasting beer, by far my favorite light beer, and it goes down so smooth in the summer, especially if it's like ice cold. I keep mine ice cold. Buy beer, get gear. Just get Labatt Blue because it's delicious anyway, and then go to rewards.labattusa.com to rack up the points for exclusive merch. Rewards.labattusa.com.
Tuck's Takes.
All right, Ross, you touched on this a little earlier, Greg, but what is your thoughts? The Saints, they signed safety Julian Blackmon to replace the Honey Badger.
I just realized I forgot to ask Greg about Julian Blackmon. That was a mistake by me. I wanted to know what he thought of Julian Blackmon. Look, Blackmon's still a young guy, and he's played a lot for the Colts. So it says something that he's played this much in his career already, but he was also available. So we'll see. By the way, that's how you know that the Saints were not expecting Tyrann Mathieu to retire, because if they were expecting that, they would have signed Blackmon or someone like him way earlier. That's a reactive signing when something happened that they weren't expecting. I would love to find out, what it is that made Mathieu decide to retire on the eve of camp like this, because that's unusual.
Dolphins corner Artie Burns, he suffered a torn ACL, and Cardinals rookie first-round pick defensive tackle Walter Nolan, he suffered a calf injury.
So yeah, there's going to be injuries. That stings for Artie for sure. The Dolphins have a lot of snaps available is probably the best way to say it, the nicest way to say it, at the cornerback position. And now Artie Burns won't be able to fill those. This calf injury is a low-key huge loss for the Arizona Cardinals. Even if Nolan is back by the opener, you wonder if he's 100%. He'll be missing all kinds of reps. I think they were really hoping and counting on him to be an impact player this year. I've seen guys that miss all of camp, and it becomes a lost season for rookies sometimes when that happens.
And Giants wide receiver Malik Neighbors, he may eventually need toe surgery, but he says he's got a great plan to manage the injury.
Well, interestingly, Dr. Chow, our friend from Pro Football Doc from sportsinjurycentral.com, sixscore.com, he had said in June during OTAs that it was a red flag that Neighbors wasn't out there because it had been over 5 months since the season and he still wasn't out there. You know, Giants fans are tweeting, he's fine, he had 3 touchdowns yesterday. You know, just because he's able to have some success on one day of practice doesn't mean that this injury won't be an issue at some point during the season. Certainly something to keep an eye on. I think we're done here.
Thanks for tuning in to the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. Make sure to also check out Even Money, Fantasy Feast, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network on Samsung TV Plus, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform.
Shout out myfrontpagestory.com. Man, I love giving out winners. I just realized I forgot to get some winners for this week, but you're all a winner if you go to myfrontpagestory.com and get a story for a loved one. Then all you do is you forward it to me, ross@rosstucker.com. You forward the email confirmation, receipt, whatever you want to call it, and I guarantee I'll send you a signed press pass in the mail. I just did that for, I think his name was Mark. I signed a signed Eagles season pass for his son Xander. So I love doing that for you guys. Just go to myfrontpagestory.com. Backofficescheduler.com, humanheadnyc.com, Sporticulture, and Pizza Boy Brewing.